baby boomers.
Used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going now?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
The recent court has been overturning precedent at a lower rate than much of the previous courts.
No one under the age of basically 50 is very enthused about this election, about these two candidates.
Eileen Brayman talks about justices. They use legal decision-making, but a lot of what is behind it is motivated reasoning.
I'm trying to get out of grumpy old man mode. And now, here are James and Emily. Good morning, Emily.
Hi, how are you?
I am fantastic. I am doing really well today.
Yes.
As you know, we are in the fabulous podcast studios of Possibilities, Inc.
Indeed.
And Possibilities held a lovely 70s themed party last night.
Yes, I see the Remnants Disco Daddy chain. I'm very sad.
Right. So
there's no video footage of this.
We had I'm trying to delete all of the video evidence or photographic evidence of my participation in that. But no, we had a great time. Wonderful. They had a couple of auctions off to support the organization. I got beat out for a package for two. I had put a bid in and it went up, and I put another bid in, and it went up, and I just couldn't go up anymore. So, yeah, but no, it was a great time. Two of my daughters attended with me. We were decked out as we should be for that kind of thing.
Very good.
Lots of fun. How about yourself? You doing all right?
Yeah, absolutely. Summertime is kind of a weird time for an academic, as you know, just kind of taking off hats and putting on other hats and trying to still get work done, et cetera. So we're going on vacation next week. So I'm ready to kind of decompress a little bit and then come back and get to work because we've got a lot of stuff coming down the pike in the fall. So.
Well, let's get into a quick news roundup. There's been a lot of stuff going on, not to mention a recent Supreme Court. This is a good tie into what we're going to be talking about today. But yesterday, the Supreme Court handed down a ruling regarding, I'm going to butcher the name of this particular drug, mifepristone.
That's right, mifepristone.
Yes. It was a ruling about access to this. So this is a type of abortion-inducing drug, right? And some states that have been passing legislation trying to greatly restrict abortion. And then there was a suit. Now, the suit didn't come from states, but it came from some doctors and some interest groups, basically. And interestingly enough, and we'll probably get into this a little bit more, 9-0 decision.
Unanimous.
Saying that that the people who brought the suit did not have standing
right.
To bring that suit. So what does that
interesting,
mean?
Right? I think that this one was incredibly interesting. And of course, it ties into the conversation that we're going to have. You can't really have a conversation about anything to do with abortion without it being ideological, obviously, but also kind of pressing upon a lot of folks' morality, right? So this one being a unanimous decision and really being based on, again, just the basics, right? That the plaintiffs themselves did not have standing. They were a group of doctors that did not prescribe it themselves, were not being forced to prescribe it. And so how, the entirety of the court saw through kind of the scheme. In fact, Kavanaugh suggested that they try other mechanisms like the legislature if they want to go about restriction of access. So I thought it was an interesting one, especially given the other sort of Supreme Court related news of the week, the leaked audio that has come out specifically related to Justice Alito. And again, directly relating to the conversation that we're about to have on ideology. So I will just leave that as a teaser, as I have a question about that in just a little bit. But yeah, the Supreme Court's been on fire this week. As it's typical getting into mid-June, late June, right? We're starting to see the wrap up and the remaining opinions, usually the most controversial ones, left to the end. So yeah, very interesting stuff going on this week in terms of the court.
And for our listeners who might not understand what we mean when the court says that a particular plaintiff does not have standing, I'm going to try to explain this.
Yes, sorry.
We do have an expert with us, Dr. Keith Eakins. And if I get this explanation wrong, feel free to correct me, Dr. Eakins. But basically, standing means that the people bringing the suit did not display that they had been harmed by the governmental action or the law, or that they are likely to be harmed by that. And so it was on that grounds that the court said, again, unanimously, you do not have the ability to basically bring this suit.
Yeah, that's close. Yeah.
All right. I got the thumbs up from Dr. Eakins, so I did.
Close enough.
Close enough for a non-expert that'll work. Right. All right. Also, we've got primary elections coming up here in Oklahoma. So if you don't know, you can vote early. Yes. And so today and tomorrow, early voting actually started yesterday.
Yes.
But if you didn't vote yesterday, you can go vote today or tomorrow. Usually you would have to go to your county election board, but you can do that. And then Tuesday from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., get out there and vote. Choose who you want to represent you.
This should not be contentious, sir, but this is one for the books. I am excited about some Oklahoma Republican primary politics.
Well, we've got this race. I don't know how much of a race it actually is. I haven't seen any polling on it, but
the amount of money that's been dropped has been
substantial, right?
Yeah.
So Representative Tom Cole from the 4th District here in Oklahoma, long-serving member of the U.S. House, longtime political figure here in the state of Oklahoma, had just been named as the chair of the Appropriations Committee, which I think is probably the most powerful committee in the House of Representatives, right? It is the committee that controls the money. So, and he was named chair within the last few months of that committee. And now he's got a primary opponent, Paul Bondar, who is a business person from Texas, apparently, who has purchased property here in Oklahoma, I guess changed his residence, and is now challenging Representative Cole for that seat. Now, most of the insiders that I've talked to don't think that Mr. Bondar has a heck of a lot of a chance. I'm just going to say it would be the most quintessential Oklahoma thing ever to have a member of the House rise to that level of power, only to be knocked off by a basically carpetbagging Texan millionaire, right? I mean, that would be Oklahoma politics in a nutshell.
He is speaking Oklahoma populist, language, though, right? This old dude who's been in the, at the Capitol for you guys for the last, 20 something years. He's been there. He's done that. He's voting against Trump, which he's not. Trump has actually officially endorsed him. But he's bringing up all of this kind of establishmentarian politics. Oh, he's in love with Adam Schiff. And I mean, just laughable, really. The latest ad where he's got these just egregious cuffs coming out of his suit sleeve. Like, I am so irked. I really just can't even. So I don't know. This guy, I can't imagine how Oklahomans would go for this, except for I am, devout and born and raised Oklahoman. Sure. And so I agree with you. This would be the absolute most right. We're going to get this establishmentarian guy out of here, and we're going to, drain the swamp with, and let this guy, come in. He's speaking the right language, but we don't know really anything about this dude.
It will be interesting to see what percentage of the vote he gets.
I agree.
I
can't imagine that there will be a runoff. I mean, I just can't imagine that he's going to challenge Tom Cole to that extent. But I think the more interesting part of things is that you've got elected officials such as Ryan Walters, who pretty much abdicated their political career in Capitol by backing Paul Bonder over a long-standing Tom Cole. In this state, that is other than picking fights with the Native Americans, going against Tom Cole is not a very wise move.
Not in Oklahoma politics. And I was really stunned that Superintendent Walters did that. But he has positioned himself in that camp of the Republican Party, now. Right? Yeah. And may think of himself as the leader of that camp, right? I think he thinks that maybe, given that Governor Stitt endorsed the governor from Florida, Ron DeSantis, for president. Maybe he feels like he has taken himself out of that leadership role. I don't know. But yeah, I think a lot of people I have talked to have said that Walters has pretty much cut his legs out from under him by taking that. So that'll be interesting to watch as well. I agree. Yeah. All right. Sometimes I have a rant.
You always have a rant. Let's keep it brief today. We've had our guests waiting for a while.
I haven't, but I'm not going to rant today. I've got I'm just going to give a shout out to all the people who helped make this podcast what it is, right?
Excellent.
From you being wonderful and absolutely great as far as helping us find guests and asking great questions and pushing me to be a little bit more organized in the approach of this, from our production team, including Santiago and Peaches, from Possibilities Inc. that provides us fabulous studio, and from our listeners who give us feedback and who promote the show with us, that kind of thing. So I'm just going to give a great shout out to all those folks that make this possible. We appreciate you very much.
Wow, that's shocking.
Are you surprised?
Right. No shaking the fist at the sky today, people.
I'm trying to get out of grumpy old man mode for
James
a little bit.
Davenport is feeling full summertime at this point.
All right. Now we're going to move to a new segment of the show that we call
I Have Questions.
And this is where we're going to bring some questions from some listeners. And Emily and I are going to answer those questions. And so Deborah, our resident Gen Z representative, is here to give us a couple of questions that we've gotten from some folks. So Deborah, what do you got for us?
This question comes from Cassidy P. Cassidy asks, with college kids and younger adults having such an impact on the upcoming election, what would be the likely results if many did not participate?
That sounds like a question for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we know what will happen and what is likely to happen, as we have been talking about this for a really long time. Unfortunately, generationally speaking, no one under the age of basically 50 is very enthused about this election, about these two candidates. And so what is most likely going to happen if the younger generations sit out and abdicate their democratic obligation, as I see it, is that you're going to have probably a repeat, likely a repeat of 2020, where it's extremely contentious. There will be a contestation of the election results because it will be close if those young folks don't come out. Most of them, or a lot of them, I should say, not most of them, but a lot of them, if they do come out, have indicated that they would be likely Biden voters. And so it will be interesting to see if he can amass a different electorate, a different part of the Democratic electorate beyond the youth vote, because it really seems like a lot of the moves, particularly related to Israel Gaza, even though polling is showing that it is right, it's the economy, stupid, and right, all of these kind of very niche issues are not that important. We're still seeing a lot of very vocally engaged and mobilized youth, who I think will likely sit out this election. So,
well, and with in this election, like the last two previous presidential elections, a swing of 1 or 2% can make all the difference in the world, right?
Yep.
All right, very good. What next?
The next question comes from both Sodona R. and Brianna B., who want to know how the U.S. government has managed to create a large national debt, why it seems to be out of control, and what can be done about it.
Oh, my goodness.
I see why you abdicated the rant. Yes.
I'm not going to go too far. Here's what I always try to tell people is all the incentives on elected members of Congress are to spend as much money as possible and keep taxes as low as possible. And that, by definition, is going to create a nice, big national debt like we see. And there's no real incentive. Back in 2010, you had this whole Tea Party movement. That was their focus. We're going to get rid of this debt. And by 2016, when Trump is elected, that's all forgotten. Trump spent more than just about anybody else during his presidency. Biden has added on to that. And that is in large part due just because there's really only in a few places is any member of Congress going to get elected saying, we need to raise more taxes on people, right? Now, you can perhaps get away with that by saying we need to raise taxes on the rich. But then the question becomes, well, who are you defining as rich? And so, the fact of the matter is they get elected and they're intent on getting elected by not overtaxing people and by spending as much federal money as they can. And that's just until electorate sends a very strong signal that they don't want that anymore, they're going to continue to get that. And so that's why we have this debt. And don't ask me when we're going to start moving it in the opposite direction. I don't know.
Fair enough.
All right.
We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu. All right.
Great questions. Thank you, Deborah.
Indeed. So let's move on to the icebreaker questions, and we're only going to do two
I like
in
that
the
idea.
sense
Yes.
of the time, because I'd really like to get to our Supreme Court conversation. So, Dr. Eakins, let's start with you. I do want to know, are you Gen X, millennial? What generation are you from?
I thought you had to be a millennial or in that area. Technically, I am a boomer, but because I'm the tail end of that. But I consider myself, I'm a self-appointed honorary member of Gen X because I've been in college forever. So I've always kind of felt like that. My defining moment was not watching, where was I when JFK got assassinated? It was, where was I when Kurt Cobain, passed? That's what I remember. So I'm definitely Gen X.
We will gladly accept you as an official member of Gen X. We will happily accept you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Dr. Jens, how about yourself? Gen X, millennial, something else?
I'm squarely within Gen X.
All right. It's nice to have Emily outmanned sometimes. A lot of the times she gets on all of these millennial and Gen Z, and I get to really feeling the old man thing going on here. All right. What other question do you want?
You get to choose the next one.
Let's do this one. What's your favorite social media platform? Dr. Jens, we'll start with you.
Well, the two that I use much at all are Facebook and Twitter, and I kind of think Twitter is both better and worse than Facebook. The Facebook is kind of more fun. Twitter is where I have more useful interactions, where I find out about new papers or new ideas, and also where I sort of have the worst interactions where, some people are just there looking to be antagonistic. So I guess if I had to give up one, I'd rather give up Twitter. That I sort of enjoy Facebook more, but I've had some good interactions actually about the paper we're going to discuss here, or the article rather, the Politico piece. I've had some good interactions from people I didn't know on Twitter that I wouldn't have otherwise had. So.
Awesome. Dr. Eakins, how about yourself?
Yeah, I would say same. I'm more, I like Twitter. I'm kind of a Twitter lurker, where I use it to get information. Yeah, I'm with Dean on that.
Very good. All right. Just for our listeners, we're going to do an abbreviated introduction of our two guests. But we do have with us Dr. Dean Jens, who is a assistant professor of economics at the University of Central Florida. And he completed his PhD in economics from Rutgers University. And his teaching experiences include econometrics and financial economics. And we're going to be discussing a piece he co-wrote in the Politico titled "Using Math to Analyze the Supreme Court Reveals an Intriguing Pattern." So officially, Dr. Jens, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
And Dr. Keith Eakins, I must again admit a conflict of interest. He taught me my one and only judicial politics class that I took because you people know that I'm IR comparative, but I did love Dr. Eakins' class. He is a wonderful professor of political science at the University of Central Oklahoma. His research and teaching focus on judicial processes, constitutional law, and administrative law. Dr. Eakins is also a licensed attorney in the state of Ohio. He and James actually just co-wrote, an op-ed for the Oklahoma Voice earlier this year regarding a proposal to reform Oklahoma's judicial selection process. So welcome, Dr. Eakins, as well.
Oh, thanks. And just minor clarification, it's pronounced Eakins, like Reagan, I guess, since we're on a political program. But it's a common mistake, so no worries.
Thank you. I apologize.
Oh, no worries.
I have been pronouncing your name wrong for over a decade, I am sure. So
yeah.
I apologize. Dr. Jens, well, let's start with you. What sparked your interest in examining the dynamics of the Supreme Court decisions, and what question were you trying to answer?
I have been, in the early days for us Gen Xers, who kind of became adults as the internet was getting big. When I was in my 20s, I liked to go out and look at the Supreme Court decisions. And I remember at one point, tabulating, who agreed with who. This was back on the court with Rehnquist. And I had to do something like this by hand, 20 some years ago, sort of going to each syllabus and figuring out who was in the majority. For the most recent round, this particular graphic that I created, I was particularly interested in Justice Jackson, right? So I was looking at the first term that she was on the court, and I was curious to see where she would fit in relative to the other justices. Was she voting, very similarly to the other two liberals she had joined? Was she voting a little bit closer to some of the other six in some ways? So I was primarily looking actually where she would sit relative to the others. And so this was kind of the first year of data that might show me something like that.
Excellent.
Why do you believe it is important to answer that question?
I was doing this for my own curiosity. So I was interested, when she was confirmed, in particular, she has this relationship by two marriages to Paul Ryan, this conservative politician from Wisconsin. She sort of had enough of a different background that I did kind of just wonder whether she would bring a very different approach from previous from previous justices. She's quite a bit younger, certainly than the other liberal justices. And so it's interesting, on your generation podcast here, one of the things I wanted to see, she's come up in the environment that has been more about originalism than some of the, the environment that some of the older justices would have come up in. So I thought it would be interesting to see whether that was reflected in her votes or whether her voting was more similar to the other Democrat-appointed justices.
Okay.
If I can barge in real quick, just a few interesting things about her.
Yeah.
Apropos of a little bit of something, I guess. She, they have the disclosures of funds that they get. She disclosed that she got like almost $4,000 worth of tickets from Beyonce to a Beyonce concert.
It was a fabulous concert.
So that was interesting. That ties into the whole Gen Z thing. And the other thing that's interesting for me about her, I haven't really looked at her, systematically looked at her decisions, but just how active she's been in oral argument. Other than the Chief Justice, she's been the most active in oral argument, which, for a freshman justice, that's pretty unusual. So she's been an interesting person to watch on the court as a newcomer. And again, with regarding disclosures of money, I think she just got like a $900,000 book deal. So she's one of the justices, one in the majority of justices that are reporting a lot of money as a side hustle, right? The only two that really kind of differ from that are Roberts and Kagan, but the rest of the justices are all in on the big money side hustles.
That's interesting. I don't want to go down a rabbit hole. We might have to come back and do a whole program.
Sorry about that.
On the side hustles of Supreme Court justices. Yeah, no, that is really interesting. Dr. Jens, can you explain kind of the methodology used in answering that question, and do so in a manner that a non-academic or a non-economist might understand?
The reason this piece came out almost a full year after the data that I used, I've been spending most of the last 10 months trying to explain it to people. So, your podcast episodes aren't 10-month long episodes, so I'll try to keep it shorter than that. But, there are a few different ways that I think about singular value decomposition. And in fact, the primary way that I think about it, this was done in the spirit of exploratory data analysis, and it's something that I've taught in data visualization courses. But I've kind of stayed away from trying to explain the way that I primarily think about it because I was worried that it's too abstract. But I tried it out on my wife, and it worked well on her. And so I'm going to try to explain this. And the thing that worries me about it is that it involves talking about very high dimensional spaces, and that can get confusing and abstract. So let me start talking about a two-dimensional space, right? Because we're used to plotting things. We're used to scatter plots, and in fact, the graphics we come up with here are scatter plots. We have my son is in middle school and has come home with this homework where if the X variable is higher, you plot it further to the right. And if the Y variable is higher, you plot it further up. And 2 dimensions is nice because we can do it on a piece of paper. A lot of the real world, right? We're used to 3-dimensional spaces, but we watch TVs. I'm looking at you on a computer screen right now. That's kind of taking 3 dimensions and putting them in 2 dimensions. And so you kind of lose some information, at least, the 2-dimensional space. We're not really seeing how far away you are. I can infer from some kind of cue sometimes, right? How far you are from the camera, but mostly I lose that direction. And so we can plot, if each justice has 56 votes, then we can imagine a 56-dimensional space where you're plotting a justice. You move over in one dimension based on how they voted on one case and a different dimension based on how they voted in a different case. And so it's very hard to visualize 56 dimensions, but it's kind of compressed down into 2 dimensions in order to plot it on the in a 2-dimensional space. And so basically it's just a projection is what it is. And if you imagine, do you guys know what the Milky Way galaxy looks like? So if you were way outside the Milky Way galaxy and you got to choose where to take a picture of it from, right? You could take a picture of it kind of from the edge, right? Or you could take a picture of it from what we might think of as above. I don't know if that's quite the right terminology to use, but you would get a better picture of it from above, right? Because the stars are more spread out in 2 of the dimensions than they are in the 3rd. So if you're going to lose one of those dimensions, you would rather lose the one where they're not very spread out. And what singular value decomposition gives us is it gives us a way of picking out which directions are they the most spread out. And so what this is it took these 9 points in this 56-dimensional space and said, okay, these are the 2 directions in which the justices are the most spread out. And so we're going to plot those, and we kind of lose everything else.
All right. All right. I have always found, as an academic, one of the best ways we can figure out if we can explain something to non-academics is try it out on our spouses, especially if they're not academics as well. So that was very good.
So what did you think you would find, and what did you find? How does this fit in within common views of the dynamics between Supreme Court justices? Is perception reality, I guess?
Right. So when I use this term exploratory data analysis, right, the way I'm teaching this data visualization, you can kind of do it for a number of different purposes. And often, even if you're building a formal model or you have, some, or you're expecting to have some hypotheses, exploratory data analysis is usually something you're doing before you have much in the way of like a deep expectation of what to do. This isn't like a hypothesis testing kind of setup. So this was really, I just want to look at the data, and this is one of the strategies I will often use when I'm first looking at a data set, is to sort of see, well, how does it cluster, right? How does it spread out? Not just cluster though, because there are clustering, right? There are specific clustering algorithms, but this would also then allow me to see, even if Jackson is within this cluster with Kagan and Sotomayor, is she closer to some of the other justices than they are, or, where is she within that cluster, right? And so I kind of went in not really knowing what to expect. I sort of vaguely expected, one direction, which is the one that gets the most attention, right? The left-right dimension here was the most important dimension that came out of the analysis. And puts the 3 Democratic appointed justices on one side and the other 6 sort of strung out along the axis, as is generally discussed, right? So that's sort of the common way of talking about the court, especially in the news media. But what was interesting to me was how this second dimension moved the 3 middle justices all in the same direction. That, in principle, if you did an analysis like this and it was really the left-right that was of most significance, you might have 3 justices in the middle who would sort of be spread out by this second dimension, but they were all moved in the same direction. And that suggests that they have something in common that's at least describing how they vote, that distinguishes them from the others, rather than sort of each being sort of in the middle in a different way in some sense.
Okay. So how does your analysis, how does that help us think about the dynamics that are at play in determining particular rulings that might be made from the Supreme Court? How does it help us make sense of those?
There's some level on which I would understand it as a statistical fact, and so you can point to certain individual decisions that have a lot to do with this separation, but I would be reluctant to sort of put too much on a single data point. But if you look, there were some cases in particular about, there was a Norfolk Southern, I think it was Norfolk Southern, one of a railroad that was involved in a lawsuit in Pennsylvania and kind of complained that this lawsuit shouldn't really be in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania courts shouldn't have jurisdiction over this. And this is a decision that ended up, if you just look in one dimension, the justices who voted on one side versus the justices who voted on the other side, they were kind of just randomly scattered from a left-right standpoint. Whereas there was more of a tendency for the justices who ended up near the bottom of the graphic in Politico to vote in the majority, and the justices at the top to vote in the dissent. And there was similarly a case with the pork producers, right, challenging rules in California about how pigs could be raised in order to sell the pork in California. And so they were saying so there was a challenge from the pork producers saying you're effectively regulating hog production outside the state of California. You shouldn't have this jurisdiction. And again, you had a similar breakdown where these justices who, again, are near the top of the graphic tended to take a more narrow view of what a state should be doing or what a state court should be doing, how it should be involving itself in situations that might not have a very tight connection to that state, right? Or to what extent they should be able to make decisions that affect the whole country in various ways.
Dr. Eakins, so a lot of research has been done with scaling, cluster analysis, et cetera. So Supreme Court scholars do not assert that conservative justices' votes are monolithic, right? However, taking the view of the forest rather than the trees, isn't it fair to say that the court, particularly with Kavanaugh, arguably being the median justice, is quite remarkable in that conservatism?
Yeah, I would agree. There's a lot to talk about here, but yeah, there's a rich literature in political science and to some extent the law, the legal scholarship that looks at different things and how do you explain judicial voting? Well, the dominant paradigm in political science is the attitudinal model. And Siegel and Spaeth, who are kind of the ones that came up with this, with this model can predict about 71% of the votes of justices. And this is on a one-dimensional scale. This is on ideology. So this is kind of the predominant model. Everyone acknowledges this is a blunt instrument. There's still a lot that it doesn't predict. But other scholars have taken other approaches. Doris Provine, who I cited a lot in my dissertation, she talks about the judicial role as constraining judicial decision making. So maybe justice's perception of, well, a judge should should have some restraint and they should maintain the appearance of impartiality, that these kinds of kind of institutional aspects of what a judge should be, judges take this into consideration and it constrains their behavior. Other political scientists have looked at the constraints of public opinion, saying that by and large, the Supreme Court's decisions tend to track public opinion, roughly. Other political scientists have come at it with a little bit of a rat choice perspective, where they have said, okay, justices, they're not 9 little law firms. They work in a collegial court. So therefore, they consider constraints within the court and then outside the court, and they try to get there to as close to their ideal point as possible. And if I could just real briefly there's a case that came out of Oklahoma, Craig v. Boren, which was a case that basically challenged the constitutionality of a liquor law that said, okay, men have to be 21 to drink alcohol, but women, you can drink alcohol at age 18, right? So this was challenged on equal protection, and Justice Brennan basically wanted to have strict scrutiny apply to gender, right? But at that point in time, strict scrutiny only applied to laws that restricted based on race. So what he did was courted other members on the court and came up with this intermediate scrutiny perspective to analyze gender cases, if you follow. So his ideal point is, I want to have strict scrutiny of any law that discriminates based on gender. But he modified that in order to attract votes, and that's what he got on Craig versus Boren. They said, okay, from now on, we will look at gender cases with intermediate scrutiny, and that's an anecdotal story, but it kind of exemplifies this theory of judicial decision making, that they are constrained. They have policy preferences, but they are constrained. Another, and I'll just go into one more area. Lawrence Baum, who's one of my mentors, he basically says, well, look, judges are people, justices are people. You know, they go to cocktail parties and they want to please their audience. They care what fellow judges and fellow lawyers think about them. So a lot of what constrains them is how they feel that others on the court others outside the court will view their decisions. So there's all kinds of, there's other, and one more I'll add is Eileen Brayman talks about justices being legal. They use legal decision making, but a lot of what is behind it is motivated reasoning. So kind of the idea that, yes, precedent is used, but a lot of, you can pick and choose which precedent to apply. And a lot of this is, motivated reasoning by their ideology. So sorry I went on and on, but, I'm just trying to give you a sense that there is a lot of nuance and a rich scholarship into this. So I hope, Dean, I assume you're, familiar with a lot of this, but I would encourage you to look at a lot of this stuff, because there really is a lot of work on this.
Are you or your organization looking for unvarnished, unbiased scholarly political analysis for your op-eds, candidates debates, or interviews regarding all things political?
Well, look no further. We are the Democracy Slingers. We're here to host, comment, educate, or just preach the good word of American politics to your school, club, company, or organization. Get in touch with us at democracyslingers@gmail.com.
So my co-author, Sarah, would be able to give you some more statistics related to this, but it is worth noting the recent court has been overturning precedent at a lower rate than much of the previous courts. I will say the math, right, is defining itself just in terms of, right, the only thing I put in for this particular plot, the only thing I put in was the votes in that term. And so it can't really define, what is sort of the middle compared to anything external. It can't define even orientation relative to anything external. So those to connect the left-right axis to sort of a left-right in terms of something defined externally, that's something we impose on the results of the math, right?
Right.
Rather than so that is sort of separate from just the raw math of what's demonstrated in the graphic.
Well, I try to tell people all the time that you can't marry up what we think of in political terms as liberal or conservative perfectly with how justices react. And we can get into that to where we see on specific policies where they might break down a little bit more. But and I have a question that's interesting to me, but I'll get to that here in a second. I do want to come back to this notion of institutionalism that you bring up in your article, Dr. Jens. If you will, kind of explain kind of how you're conceptualizing what you mean by institutionalism, what role that might be playing, and then if someone was going to do some follow-up research on this, what suggestions would you have for them, and how would you operationalize that, and how would you measure that as an impact on judicial thinking or ruling, if you will?
So this does come a little bit more from my co-author, and I am certainly in sympathy with her on this, but I'm sure she would give you a better explanation. But to take Roberts, for example, he has been viewed as institutionalist for a while, and he and in terms of the back and forth that you were discussing just a moment ago, there's some thought that perhaps he switched his vote in the Obamacare cases, right, sort of towards the last minute in conversation with some of the other justices. But there was a sense that maybe he came out with that vote in part because he thought that it would be more radical for the court, right? That it was in response to outside pressures, and it was in response to considerations for how will the institution of the court be perceived if we don't sort of come to this conclusion. So Sarah, the reason I sort of reached out to her with this graph in the first place was that this group of 3 justices that had clustered near the top of my graphic were the 3 that she has been describing as institutionalists, that they often have a little bit more of a concern, a little bit more emphasis on precedent. Again, going to Roberts, there was an abortion case before Dobbs that came out of Louisiana about a year or two after a case that came out of, I think it was Texas, that were basically the same case. They were very similar cases. And he voted in the dissent on the first case, but then he voted with the majority in the second case because of the stare decisis, right? Even though he had previously voted in favor of the state in the first case, he was now voting against the state because, well, we decided that a year or two ago, and I'm not going to override stare decisis, just because I thought it was wrong then, right? Every justice, of course, is going to have some point at which, if they think it was wrongly enough decided, that they will overcome that stare decisis. But he also, in the Dobbs decision, was the most reluctant to make a sweeping change. He wanted to take the most incremental step. You will often see Kavanaugh. There have been a number of opinions written by Kavanaugh, or concurrences usually, written by Kavanaugh, in which he explicitly kind of cabins the sweep of the decision, right? Where he specifically says, this applies to these facts, and here are some things that this wouldn't necessarily apply to, right? This is some ways in which this is specific to this case. And so these are ways in which these justices are expressing an abiding interest in the institution of the Supreme Court, in the way that the judicial system itself has continued to work, and in terms of its how it is viewed from the outside, and staying within sort of the case or controversy before it.
I think that's right to some degree. I think probably where we differ is what has the greatest explanatory power. Okay. And that's what I think most political scientists and a lot of legal scholars would argue, that it is ideology. So, you mentioned Roberts, and Roberts, he's a good example. And actually there was a study by Frank Cross. I think it was called Chief Justice Roberts and Precedent. And Cross basically says that, and I love this line that I can't take credit for, but he said, Roberts is a dismantler rather than a bomb thrower. He doesn't ignore or overrule precedent, but rather shapes it to his liking. And I think that in a nutshell kind of describes a lot of how political scientists view precedent, that it's not that precedent doesn't matter. It's not that all justices you look at precedent as an either or proposition, but rather that precedent is a tool that can be used to justify outcomes or shape outcomes. Another thing that Cross says about Roberts is that he builds an edifice of precedent that may someday be solid. So Dobbs is a good example. He was trying to, his preference would have been to move that direction, but not so quickly. That's kind of a good way to describe Roberts. What direction he's going. He's not as bold as some of the other justices. So, precedent, it matters, but there's so much precedent out there. I guess most political scientists would argue that it can be, the more extreme, like Siegel and Spaeth would say, well, precedent is just window dressing. And then others who look at it more subtly, I can't think of the name of the guy right now, but there was a really influential APSR article about jurisprudential regimes, and basically saying that precedent matters in that it structures decision making, but it doesn't dictate outcomes, right? So you have the test of content neutrality, or you have the test, you have balancing tests, or you have the lemon test, right? Which, rest in peace, lemon test. But these are things that kind of structure a way that justices approach issues, but it doesn't dictate outcomes. And political scientists, myself included, would say, well, I think what mostly matters is probably ideology, right? But they each differ. They're not monolithic, but ideology, I would argue, explains the most.
Well, and the left-right is a bigger effect in my singular value decomposition. The axis that we ended up as the horizontal axis, that was the bigger effect in terms of just explaining in a statistical sense the votes.
Here's a question that just struck me when I was looking at your chart, Dr. Jens, map showing how much each of the justices agreed or with the other justices, and it just struck me that what we would consider the most liberal justices agreed with the most conservative justices over 60% of the time. And I'm just wondering, is there a case to be made that the entire court is rather conservative when you get that you're going to find narrow? And you pointed out there are a few cases where you had a clear 6-3, all of the considered conservative justices voted one way and the liberal justice voted that. But that was a very small percentage of the cases in which there were divisions over, right? And I'm just wondering, is this court rather in its entirety, even when you look at those, what we consider the liberal justice, is it really a conservative court across the board when you have that much agreement? Or am I reading too much in the overlap between those very liberal and those very conservative justices?
I would say that there actually are a lot of the cases that the court handles are right, as much as the media will portray, they voted against, this particularly sympathetic, appellant or something, right? You'll often read, okay, they voted for the NRA, right? Well, that was a unanimous decision, and it's not because the liberal justices are fans of the NRA. It's because the decisions below that were kind of egregious in how they applied the law. We just had this again unanimous vote on mifeprestone that you mentioned in your news segment, and like you said, it was on standing, and some of the headlines that you're going to read, or even news articles, we'll sort of gloss over, well, why did they rule this? But they do have, especially I would think some of the conservative justices seem to have this narrow notion of standing where they're going to decide it on a grounds that's very different from the political valence of abortion, right? And so the way these things get reported, I think especially in a politics lens, is confusing. It ignores what actually is often the dynamics, the basis on which these decisions are made, even when they do kind of correlate with left-right. It's being made on the basis of some detail in the fact pattern that is getting glossed over when it's reported as, this particular party versus this other particular party. And one of them is more sympathetic, or one of them is coded as left and one is coded as right. But the actual complaint, may have some details that are important that depend on something else.
Yeah, that's a great point. I agree 100%. And the way I see it often is they treat procedural decisions as substantive decisions. So like the standing, conservative justices have a lot of skin in the game to want to restrict standing, right? So, that doesn't get reported. The other thing that drives me crazy personally is treating cert decisions as outcomes. So, it used to be like I had examples in my class before Dobbs that, the Supreme Court struck down an abortion decision. And it's like, no, they just denied cert. Denial of cert is like a decision to not hear a case. There's nothing substantive about it. So I would agree with Dean 100% there that I think the media could do a better job of conveying what the decisions are and giving better context when they make procedural decisions.
Fantastic. Do you have a final question you want to throw?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious. The news just came through that they threw out the Trump era ban on bump stocks. It was a 6-3 decision. I was just kind of curious if there were any other kind of outstanding cases that either of you saw that may be controversially decided, or do we kind of expect for things to kind of shake out in this kind of 6-3?
That must be hot off the press. I hadn't heard that.
Yes, Dr. Stacey,
it just happened.
Hey, we are on top of breaking news right here.
You're cutting edge, man. I like it. As before that, I think the court still had 26 cases, pending. So the ones that stick in my mind are a couple of the Trump cases. There's actually a substantive abortion case on emergency room doctors treatment, and those are the ones that come to mind. Also the gun case. So yeah, that's very interesting.
Dr. Jens, anything you're looking at?
I don't have any off the top of my head, but in response, that Idaho case, that abortion case you're referring to, I think that one could be interesting to see how it comes out, because the oral argument for that was kind of strange, where the justices were trying to figure out whether there was even a case here, because the two sides seemed to disagree about what had been stipulated, that or whether it may well be decided that the Idaho law, as it's actually intended and being interpreted in the courts, is perfectly consistent with the federal law, in which case there's nothing for but they may be required to continue to handle it the way they've been handling it, right? That the Idaho law, as actually applied, may not be in conflict with the federal law, but there are some potential conflicts raised that may in fact actually not exist in practice. So it'll be interesting to see how they parse that, and it might be one of these cases where it's hard to tell whether certain opinions are really concurrences or dissents. It might be something like the EPA wetlands case 2 years ago that where you had 4 justices on a side that sort of looked like a dissent, but it was sort of a concurrence. And this could end up being kind of a mess the same way because because again, some of the details of the argument were actually a lot more complicated than, how much are states allowed to restrict abortion in emergency care settings.
Well, we want to thank again Dr. Dean Jens from the University of Central Florida and Dr. Keith Eakins from the University of Central Oklahoma.
Eakins with an A.
I have been saying that wrong for a long time. You're going to have to.
That's all right.
I apologize again. Dr. Keith Eakins from the University of Central Oklahoma. Thank you for a very interesting conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And we want to remind our listeners,
democracy is not a spectator sport.
We'll see you all next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, this is Deborah, the resident Gen Z member of the Not My Generation podcast family. Not My Generation is produced in the Possibilities Inc. studio. This episode was produced by Santiago Ramones. It was edited by Santiago Ramones. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. Send a voice memo to notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu and you could hear your voice on an upcoming episode. If you liked today's episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and sharing the podcast with others. You can check out previous episodes on any podcast app and on our podcast website at notmygeneration.captivate.fm, where we also provide our show notes. And remember, you can follow Not My Generation on X, formerly known as Twitter, at NMG Podcast, and on Facebook at Not My Generation Podcast. We look forward to interacting with you soon.